Yeah, I know, I'm late to the party with this one. I promised every Friday, but better late than never. So let's talk horror movies. Hey, movie fans! So last Friday we took a look at the origin of the history of horror movies with the Universal Classics, Phantom of the Opera, etc., etc. We had a great time. So let's continue down that trend with History of Horror Part 2. Now we pick up where American horror was kind of more or less dead. We weren't really interested in it. Universal was just like, we made a lot of money with the Frankenstein and Dracula movies, but they don't seem to be bringing in the big bucks anymore, so we'll move on to other projects. So, where do we go for horror? How about across the pond to our friends over in England with Hammer Films? Now, Hammer was a relatively low-budget production company that actually ended up filming a lot of their movies in-house, like actually just in their big old castle thing. So if you actually watch their movies, they use a lot of the same locations, just use different sets and camera angles to disguise the fact that they all filmed in one location because they were so low budget and cheap, and a lot of the films were made for the cheap. Hammer really wanted to invest in the horror genre, really reinvigorate it and give it new spins on the stories that we already knew. So they wanted to go more adult oriented this time around, more bright colored blood now that the films could be brought in color. And boy was that blood bright red to the point of it doesn't actually look like blood, it looks like movie prop blood. So much so that Tim Burton, who was a big fan of Hammer films growing up, when he made his version of Sleepy Hollow, he kind of more or less brought in the Hammer blood as an homage to those, which explains why everything is so bright in that as opposed to most Tim Burton movies, which are drab and dreary in their color palette. They also made a lot more adult oriented content in their movies, to say the least. Now, you can kind of guess what I mean by that, but they weren't really going for all around anybody could watch this. This was definitely more for the mature audiences. So, they wanted to tackle the ones that Universal had already established, that were already based on the books. So with Universal, it started with Dracula, then we got Frankenstein. With Hammer Films, we got Frankenstein, then we got Dracula. It's just swapped, but it proved to be very, very successful for Hammer Films. Hammer Films needed its tentpole actors that could carry the future franchises like Universal before. Universal had actors like Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff, Lon Chaney Jr. and Sr., more or less to bolster their lineup. So Hammer Films decided to go with two proven British actors to more or less carry these franchises going forward. Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, which are names that you guys still know to this day. Christopher Lee as the villain in almost everything, but most notably Saruman and Count Dooku for the Star Wars and Lord of the Rings fans out there, and also Peter Cushing, better known as Grand Moff Tarkin. With Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee leading the way, Curse of Frankenstein and Dracula both proved to be smash hits. So, of course, just like Universal and made all the mistakes before it, Hammer was just like, you know what, let's churn out sequel after sequel. And both, I believe, Frankenstein ended up getting like 8 sequels, and Dracula got like 7 sequels. There was a ton of sequels, and eventually it just kind of trickled and didn't get the returns, kind of just like Universal. Noticing any trends with horror, it's always like a cycle. New idea, milk that to death. It's not like that's a problem that we still have to this day. However, besides the use of color with their blood and more of their adult-oriented content, Hammer is also known for bringing in more of the comedic aspects into horror, blending the first kind of horror comedies, which is kind of a niche thing today, as they kind of blend really well together, but you have to do it right. And Hammer was the first to actually do that and really incorporate that into a lot of their movies with a dry, dark sense of humor, which a lot of filmmakers try and emulate today if they can pull it off correctly. However, as they kept churning out sequels, the Hammer reputation just wasn't as strong as it used to be, and the box office returns were dwindling each time around, and so they were kind of fading like a horse at the Kentucky Derby down the stretch, and so they eventually closed their doors in 1979. While Hammer began to become not the main powerhouse that it used to be, creativity was found again in America through real-life horror with Ed Gein. Gein. However you want to say that. Be my guest if you know the correct pronunciation of that guy's name. But he was the first psychotic killer, like actual real-life killer, that was found in American history. And to this day, he's still kind of spoken in hushed tones. I won't go into too much detail about Ed Gein, but let's just say he was one of the first mentally ill serial killers in American history, and there was a lot of people that were disturbed by him, obviously, because he did some very disturbing and horrendous things. But especially for the 1950s, that was completely unheard of, to the point of there's a writer named Robert Bloch that wanted to essentially make a story based on the Ed Gein character, except Ed Gein was real. His character would obviously be fictitious, and he wanted to bring in this character that had some other issues combined with the Ed Gein character traits of murder and some other horrendous acts. So, what was this character's name going to end up being? Norman Bates. That's right, Robert Bloch wrote a little thing called Psycho. You probably may not have never heard of it. It's not that big of a deal. It's only one of the most influential and successful horror movies of all time. The film was famously directed by Alfred Hitchcock, who was initially reluctant to actually take this role, but he liked the challenge because the studio was just like, okay, we'll let you do this project. It's going to be almost unfilmable because of the content. Granted, this was 1960 when the film came out, so they were a bit stricter in what you couldn't show. So Alfred Hitchcock wanted to basically press the censor, as he said, and basically like push the limit of what was acceptable. And he was doing it on a shoestring budget because the studio did not really want to back him at all. So basically, he also did a lot of television work besides his famous movies. So they're like, we'll give you basically a television budget for this. And Alfred Hitchcock just rolled up his sleeves and was like, bring it on, I can do it. So he basically worked on a shoestring budget. He basically like cutting all the corners that he could, but still making an excellent movie. And he knew the shower scene with Marion Crane was like the crux of the story. He had to get that right, and it was by far one of the most difficult, but one of the most legendary movie scenes in history. Typically, Alfred Hitchcock filmed his films in color, like The Birds, North by Northwest, and so on. But this one he filmed in black and white, more or less so he can get away with different stuff and use different tactics and bring in more of a challenge for himself because he liked a challenge. Like the shower scene that I just mentioned, the blood that you see in the scene is actually chocolate syrup. Now, you couldn't get away with that if it was in color because blood is not black. It's not gooey and delicious. He wanted to go with something thicker that could obviously be seen on the camera, and food coloring and red dye number 9 didn't really work for a black and white movie, so he had chocolate syrup instead. Alfred Hitchcock cast Anthony Perkins and Janet Leigh as the two main characters of Norman Bates and Marion Crane, respectively. Janet Leigh. Interesting. She's known mainly for that shower scene and that famous scream that she lets out right before she's killed, making her one of the very first Scream Queens. Interesting to note that one of her offspring would later become one of the most famous Scream Queens of all time, but we'll get to her in the next episode. Besides the now iconic shower scene, Psycho really stands the test of time because of its marketing campaign. Every good horror movie should have a very solid marketing campaign behind it, and Hitchcock's Psycho is by far one of the best of all time. Like, on par with Blair Witch Project's marketing campaign, but we'll get to that in a future video as well. So what made Psycho stand out for its PR alone? Well, Hitchcock gave very specific orders to every theater that Psycho was showing in that basically you let the people into the movie, but once the movie starts, no one else is allowed in. So basically, if someone's like 2 minutes late, sorry, you gotta wait for the next showing. And then when people come out of the theater, they're not allowed to whisper a word to anybody. Like, at all. This is before internet spoilers. You can't even just say anything as you're walking out of the theater for fear of spoiling it. And there's some major spoilers for people in the audience. And that is radical. People were not too happy with that rule at first, but it drew up significant interest of people were like, well, why can't we go in? Is there something so big in this movie that it sparked so much curiosity that they had to know why they were kept in the dark? And when they saw it, yeah, they were obviously surprised by the calm and collective Norman Bates ends up being the killer. And it was unheard of at the time that the average nice guy ends up being the killer. Yeah, that's a trope that's overdone to this day, but Psycho was the first one to go, okay, we feel bad for Norman Bates. He's a kind, nice guy. Oh, no, his mother's actually dead and he's the one doing all these heinous murders. It was revolutionary, genuinely shocking, and more or less inspired the whole slasher genre that would come to be, because it was the first mass murder. Because up until this point, you had movies like Frankenstein or Dracula, which relied on supernatural beings that were mystical in their ways, whereas Norman Bates, there was nothing mystical or foreign about him. He was just a man with some seriously messed up things in his head that just went around killing people. He was an average human being, and that whole trope ended up becoming a horror staple, so to speak, and really inspired a lot of other people to just go, we can make a lot of money out of that. But we'll cover that in the next installment, where we look at more of the slasher movies. Well, what did you guys think of this installment of History of Horror Part 2? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, if you like what you see and want to see more, subscribe to the channel, or find me on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Uncharted Media. Stay sharp, movie guys and gals!